Let's go through 4 of my recent art studies that I made digitally in Procreate in order to practice my artwork. This first one here is a Merfolk character. One of my original characters, Nia Davis. One of the Merfolk characters I made up for various stories. So I spent some time first trying to imagine her and deciding exactly what I would do. I'd actually found a really inspirational reference for the lighting. I then gathered an entirely different reference, which was very, very similar looking to the character itself, and was completely different than the one I used for the lighting. Then I went and gathered other references of sunsets and things that I knew would fit more for the background I was working on. I knew there was going to be a rocky pool, which was semicircular and had waterfalls going into it. Based on the lighting, I knew it would need to be sunset. I ended up using 2 separate main references to help me figure out how to create the background, which means I used 4 separate references. More often I advise, when you're doing a completely original work, that you do thumbnails first, but in this case it was more of a study and practice for the lighting and for mismatching different references together to create some of my original characters as artwork. As you can see, I ended up doing the layers on top. I used hard light blending mode on the layer options in order to create the lighting. I was so interested in trying to capture the beautiful lighting from my reference that after doing the initial sketch, I moved right to the lighting before doing the midtones or the background in more detail. This is a fine method, but remember that the lighting will change once you add those midtones and flat colors in the background. You don't always have to do everything by doing the flat colors first. As you can see here, I actually did the lighting after the initial sketch. Now I finally add in the flat colors, which are the base tones for the actual physical form of the body and the structures underneath the lighting. There isn't just one correct way. You can do things in different orders. I even change how I do things based on my mood with each artwork and based on the materials I'm using. Because I knew where she lived, there are several round pools that are deep, clear, tropical fresh water with underwater tunnels that goes to other pools, waterways, and rivers in the magical place that I have invented. I made sure to look up different reference for backgrounds, so the lighting matched closely, like I said, but also so that it would fit my imaginary idea for this curved rocky pool. I didn't make the background too detailed, because the focus was definitely on the figure for this artwork, but I did want to imply the background enough. I also practiced using different brushes I'm not normally using and tried out different artistic and downloaded brushes I had because I was willing to be rough and loose with the painterly textures in this piece. So that this piece also accomplished practicing with different brushes. Because it was a practice piece, there's much less pressure involved. Most of the lighting involved is on a hard light layer, and most of the shadows on their own layer are on multiply. Everything else tends to be normal mode for this one. This is more of a direct art study practice from a direct reference. As you can see on its own layer, I created these red lines as a sort of grid to help me get my picture more accurate. Art is representation, not duplication, so I was still drawing it more in my own style. I always make the eyes larger, for example, and I don't necessarily follow the proportions exactly perfectly. I do fix that horribly wonky arm. I also end up changing Talison's jacket. So the subjects here are Taliesin Jaffe and Matthew Mercer. This is a screenshot from an old show called Talks Machina, which will be coming back soon. And I intended to do an art study from this ages ago, but actually forgot to, so I decided to go back and do it now. I wanted to get more emotional body language, facial expressions, and you can get more genuine reactions from screenshots from TV shows and movies and people's videos than you can from most of the still composed posed photos. Posed models are often less emotional or true to the emotions that people are feeling and are more artistically stationed. So often I find it's better for getting emotions if you do screenshots from videos. I used a separate reference, not pictured here, to get the jacket. I decided to change the jacket over. I also simplified some of the facets in the clothing by removing graphical elements and sparkly details because I just changed the style a bit. And you don't have to make everything exactly the same as the reference. Unless you're going for exact hyper-realism, remember that you can stylize, simplify, and change things a bit. There were a few things I would consider slightly mistakes, but because this was a timed study in that I didn't want to take too long working at it before moving on to something else, I decided I didn't have time to fix them. One of the things is I didn't make Matt's forehead large enough, even for the style I'm using. And I might have wanted to add the graphical details onto Talison's shirt, but I ended up deciding to just go with this. I also think that it's a good idea to remember that line art doesn't exist in reality, but there's absolutely nothing wrong with having a line art heavy art style. It's its own art style and it can be quite beautiful. I ended up deciding to change his shirt purple as well. This begins with an abstract painting, doing various experiments, trying out different brushes I recently downloaded and brushes that exist since the update to Procreate 5. After creating a beautiful abstract background, I took out my different, very inspirational references, which were screenshots from one of the latest Blackpink music videos. What I did with that is I decided to do it over top of my abstract background rather than using the background from the video. Otherwise, it's more of a direct art study. I created her in 6 main layers to start with. 3 different line art layers, one for her body in the background, one for the arm, and one for the hands, followed directly underneath by a flat color layer, which is easy to set to alpha lock mode so you only paint where you've already painted. I did this for a very important reason, so I can add the blur effects later without any difficulty at all and very quickly. The other thing I did with this is keep her bald for quite a long time. Because the structure of the skull underneath would be overcovered by the hair, which I had created here as you can see, on its own layers, which were then merged down with the body layer underneath. Once I was ready, I merged them down with the body layer underneath. I was trying out a couple different painterly styles. I didn't want to overdo the shading, but I didn't want to underdo it either, and I wanted a little bit of texture, but not too much. I also intentionally wanted to use a color hold line arting style with this, and as it's more in my own style, there's obviously larger than normal eyes. In the adjustments palette with the magic wand symbol, one of the options will be blurs. In fact, there are several versions. You can use Gaussian blur, motion blur, radial blur, and other blurs. I advise you have whatever you wish to blur to different degrees on their own layers. I merged down the line art with the flats and then blurred those layers. I did not blur the body, I blurred the arm a little, and I blurred the hand a lot. This last one is a fan art, which is more original rather than studied from direct reference. However, I did use a lot of reference to help create it, so I decided to keep it as the 4th part of this video. Completely from imagination, I did the initial sketch that you saw, the ocean, the sky, and the rough ship. This whole section here, I did not look at any reference and I figured out exactly what I wanted to paint. And I did this whole concept completely from imagination based on a scene from the show Critical Role. I probably should have worked on a larger canvas for how great this ends up becoming, but I decided I really liked it. On a layer above, I do a good line art. I look at reference of sea turtles, and I think about how I remembered the miniature of the dragon turtle looking, and what I know about dragon turtles, in order to work on the final version for the dragon turtle. I also looked up, gathered, and referenced many different references of actual tall ships historically, and I ended up looking up reference of the specific ship from this show to help me create the art for this. This was a lot of work. It took a lot of time. I worked thinking of the 3-dimensional space, and I worked on different layers so that I could merge down. I ended up having to erase a lot of lines behind things because I was trying to make sure the 3-dimensional space worked. So I worked through and then erased. There was a lot of adjusting to get things to look right, but also more accurate. I used a lot of reference from real tall ships, like I said, but I Frankensteined together this ship. For artworks with line art and flats as the main painting method you're using, I advise you have a separate layer behind for background and keep all the line art on their own layers. The ship has its own layer I keep flattening down once I can, and the flat colors underneath have their own layers. The color on the turtle has its own layer, and the line art is on a separate layer above. You can then alpha lock and create clipping mask layers. I advise to save space, you flatten layers down as soon as you reasonably can. But I do advise you keep the line art and the flat or colors underneath as separate layers. You can also put different layers on top. Here I add shadows by doing a multiply layer set to clipping mask over the flat colors. I also experimented with the different splotchy colors on multiply layers above the flats. Above that, you can set it to hard light or linear light, glow, different lighting modes to see what looks good. And you can do the shafts of light going through the water. On a layer on top, I do splashes of water. I can also do a layer above set to different lighting modes to create different lighting effects. For some of the darkness in the water, I could set it to multiply so that it darkens and makes things semi-transparent. I used a lot of layers on this artwork, but the canvas size wasn't too big, so it wasn't an issue. However, keeping in mind the canvas size limitations of Procreate, remember to merge down to fewer layers when possible. But I do advise you keep layers separate that would make your life easier, such as keeping the background separate from one of the figures and keeping the line art separate from the flats or colors of a character. Keeping the line art separate makes it really easy to color the line art if you decide to go for a color holds look or to completely eliminate it and create a painterly look without the line art. But if you merge the line art together with the colors, it's much harder to do these things. Here's right around where I looked at one of the fan arts of the ship the Ball Eater and realized I forgot that there was a balcony and a double door leading out to it at the rear of the ship that leads from the captain's quarters to overlook the water. This is where I had to add it in. Because I'd been keeping my layers separate, the line art and the flats and such, it was quite easy to erase things and add it in. And here I am correcting the splashes of the water, which had still been really rough. Using a bright yellow, more towards white, I used an adds layer on top of everything else, the lighting adjust add layer, to create the bright sunlight. Using a multiply layer, I added more bluish shadows in after looking at several references of tall ships that were in these sunlit conditions. They had darker, more bluish shadows on the sails, so I added that in for further realism. Observe and learn what you can from your reference to your own advantage, and don't be afraid to take your own references as needed. Don't follow the reference if it doesn't follow your artistic vision, and I'll have a new video soon. I hope to see you again soon. Okay, bye!